Good morning. Well, hello, good morning and welcome, if I channel my inner Robin Day. It's lovely to see so many friendly faces, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you also to SBS for inviting James and myself to present on this platform. It's a sign of the times and a reflection of just how important the current energy crisis is that you have taken time from your busy schedules to join us this morning, so thank you. Please keep an eye out for future presentations on the coffee morning slot. I will be running one in May on CIF, where we will pick over the bones of the published awards, and I will help answer questions in terms of why your bid was unsuccessful ahead of a potential new submission in December. My name is Tim Warneford. I'm an Academy School funding consultant who secures government funding and attracts inward investment to improve the school estate for my Academy clients. I'm joined today by James Robson, MD of Powerful Allies, an ISBL partner and independent energy brokers to hundreds of schools of all stripes, and tellingly, most of which will not be with us today, as they were advised to go to market ahead of the spectacular hikes in energy costs over the past 12 months, and as a result, will have secured themselves considerable savings. This in itself begs us the question of why energy brokers worth their salt did not anticipate the spike and what they did to lobby clients to come to market earlier. Too many of you have had your new rates presented to you at the 11th hour, and this has reduced your options for returning to the market to secure a better deal. The recent coverage in both Schools Week and TES showed once again how out of touch our dear friends at the DfE are when it comes to energy procurement. Their claim that energy costs only amount to 1.5% of a school budget and was therefore inconsequential is in stark contrast to the reality on the ground. Now, I did note Chris Hall coming in today, and I'd just like to thank you, Chris, for allowing us to use your quote. So Chris Hall, Director of Finance at the Inspiring Primaries Academy Trust, perfectly illustrates the point when he talks about the Hobson's choice facing his trust. Whether to opt for a cost certainty over a 12-month contract at a 126% increase, or whether to take the hit of a staggering 170% rise for a 12-month contract in the hope that prices have peaked and will drop the following year. As Chris O'Shea, the chief executive of Centrica, has warned himself, there is no reason to think that energy prices will come down anytime soon and could be the norm for another 2 years. Stephen Morales, ISBL CEO, seems to be advocating the short-term approach, hedging bets on a drop in rates either this summer or next, and thus avoiding entering into a long-term 3 to 5 year fixed contracts that schools may come to regret at their leisure. However, there are many schools, to my knowledge, who are currently regretting at their leisure, having balked at the rates quoted last summer of perhaps a 30% increase, and who have deferred only to see the increase go above 100%. Is there some paralysis at board level? Do governors feel inhibited about making these decisions, and who are they turning to for advice? Those of us who adopt a strategic estate management approach to matters relating to energy will always work in collaboration with the board and the estates team so that all parties are joined up and buy into the recommendations that we've reached. And these recommendations will have come through due diligence and through adequate options appraisals so that the school can move on with confidence. None of us, non-energy procurement experts, can see into the future. But if there is one man whose opinion and record I trust above all others, it's James Robson. This morning's session is going to run as follows. James will take us through the identified scenarios which schools face looking towards procuring in 2022. And he will provide a range of options that school leaders can calculate depending on their own appetite for risk. At the end of James's presentation, we will take questions. And if you have details of your existing contracts, James will try and answer your specific individual needs. He will be, for an hour, our very own Martin Lewis money saving expert. If you would like to discuss any of your energy procurement management or funding options offline. We're both available after this session and we can be contacted at any time. The focus for today's presentation concerns energy procurement. But if we have time, I want to highlight the interconnection between energy procurement, energy management, and your funding options for renewable installations, such as LED and solar, and how the carbon and cost savings that you can accrue can be lost if the contract that you have has within it these nasty little clauses called volume tolerances. Anyway, that's enough from me. I'm going to hand you back to Becky, who will then hand you on to James.
Thanks, Tim. So just another poll, if you wouldn't mind filling in for us just before we begin. Just like to understand the landscape of where everybody is currently. So just to ask you where you feel that your school or trust is currently on your procurement journey. So it is anonymous, so you can just choose which bird. So you will have seen from the packs that we sent out in advance for you to have a look and see where you are with your contract, and if you just choose which owl your school or trust associates with. Total contracts ending in September, procured via the local authority or a framework or via a broker. Just give that a few more minutes just for people to be able to pop in their selection. Nobody on a standard energy tariff at the moment. One or two on April. Yep, highest percentage seems to be via the local authority or a framework.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to James Robson.
Thanks, Becky. Thank you very much for joining us this morning, and particularly those of you who have taken time out of your half term to do so. I'm also very pleased to see some familiar faces. I think we've in such a rapidly changing environment at the moment. I wanted to just approach this from a slightly different angle to start with. So rather than getting straight down into the detail, I want to just take a top line view. Academies have become relatively newly acquainted with how to buy energy contracts. It's not something that many academies have ever had to do before, and judging from the poll, many academies and multi-academy trusts remain within the environment of local authority procurement, and that's no great surprise. I started Pathwise 10 years ago, having been a commercial helicopter operator, so my world was nothing to do with energy. And I suspect for many of you, it's the same. Your world is nothing to do with energy, really. You have a lot more to deal with. And Powerful Allies really was about a process of simplifying and demystifying the whole process of energy procurement, primarily for very large users. Our first clients were then and still are much, much larger than individual academies. But we learned from those experiences, and each of those clients have other competencies, and our job has been to educate them in how to protect themselves for the future. One of the characteristics of energy procurement, which is not understood at all, and indeed the local authorities fail to take advantage of, is it is effectively a forward commodity trade, which means that at any time, one can go to suppliers and ask them for forward pricing on contracts, which may start some years ahead. This is very rarely done. And indeed, it's almost uniquely a field in which we operate. And the point of that is that you can then take judgments well in advance to protect yourselves for the future. Now, the market has always been very volatile. This isn't a unique thing, although I have to say the scale of pricing volatility is unprecedented at the moment. But if we look back over the years that I've been in business in this area, the markets have always gone up and down. And it really isn't rocket science to look at the point at which markets are low and to then look at whether one can contract forward at those prices to protect for the future. And this is how large commercial energy users have always operated. So, for example, let's look at the most recent time when the market was on its knees, was in April 2020, shortly after lockdown. It was no great surprise. There was a surplus of energy that nobody wanted. Hospitality industry was virtually closed. and suppliers were themselves in desperate state, and it meant the market was very low. And I don't know if you've seen the graphs that were sent forward, but you'll see historically there have been dips in the market. At that point, my company was working flat out. Quite literally, every one of our large clients went into contracts at that point, many of which wouldn't be starting for 2 or 3 years. As a result of which, all of our largest clients are in fixed price contracts set back in April 2020 out to 25 or 26 or 27. Now, one could say that was a risk. Of course it was, but it was a calculated risk. We knew it was an unprecedented low market. It was a good time to buy. It's turned out to be a spectacular strategy, but that wasn't really our ambition. Our ambition was to provide certainty going forward. So the fundamental difference, I think, between the way that schools buy, and many others, by the way, and the way the rest of the world operates, is to fail to look forward. And I think this is very difficult in presentations to trustees and governors, to get them to sense the notion that you're signing something today which won't even start for 2 years' time. It's an entirely different culture. The downside of that, of course, is that you are taking a risk. So, of course, you put your neck on the block if it turns out that the market has still some way to fall. But you're not going to do that today. And what we're not asking you to do today is to go into 5-year contracts in the market today. That would simply be absurd. When we look at the main procurement methods, and you've highlighted many of you within local authorities, the reason, in my view, we've been very and fundamentally opposed to the local authority procurement is it's not designed for your purpose. Local authority procurement says it's all. It is designed for local authorities. Historically, they had to buy through ODU. They have what's called a framework, so they don't buy forward, they don't involve competitive tender in that process. A framework to design for local authorities, which may have many thousands of meters to deal with, and the last thing they want to do is to change supplier. Now that ensures at the outset that you cannot get best value because you no longer have the benefit of competitive tender. And the one thing we have in this country is an extraordinarily competitive supplier market. If we were to do a tender tomorrow for a gas contract for a school, we would have probably 8 or 10 suppliers all providing the same gas, but their pricing will be significantly different. And that is the market we work in. In many ways, it's almost a perfectly competitive market because the energy supply is, broadly speaking, identical. Okay, so let's just concentrate on local authority procurement because it's one of the birds in Tim's wonderful analysis. If you are buying within a framework, the supplier will never agree to fix a price for a long way forward. Suppliers simply don't do that. So you end up buying short term, broadly speaking, in 6-month tranches. It's perfectly possible that your local authority framework with contracts ending end of March has not even yet placed that contract going forward. Certainly in September, it would be very common to find that they're still trading in August for September renewal. So if you go to them and say, how much am I going to pay next year? In all honesty, they won't know, or very rarely know. Furthermore, the contract structure they put in place is very rarely a fully fixed contract. It usually has elements within it which will vary. And it seems to me that this methodology of buying late in the day, it has always been unsuccessful and right now is catastrophic. What I want the message for you today is to consider really changing the way in which you look at the future for energy. It is going to remain a very major part of your overhead, increasingly so. And unless we change behavior, the behavior is going to repeat itself. There will be other global disasters that come about. There will be other catastrophes we face which will cause global pricing to move. And you can't find yourself permanently on the edge of your seat, waiting to see what you're next going to be hit with. So for me, the main purpose I would say today is to say, think strategically about your energy pricing. Now, the chances are, if you're with another energy broker, of which there are a number, that they're not thinking strategically at all. They're thinking of their short-term profit. They want to sell you a contract. We're called every day by brokers trying to sell us contracts. Shows how completely disjointed they are. And I'm sure your schools and academies are being bombarded by cold calls. You have to question yourself, why would anybody cold call today with the market as high as it is? why would any broker try and encourage a school to go into a contract today in a market as it stands? It's because their commission is paid up front and they need commission. That's their lifeblood. Now, I can't imagine a school would respond to a cold call from a lawyer, for example, or an accountant, and choose their legal advisors on the basis of a cold call. So why would schools, and academies respond to cold calls on what is one of their largest overheads? It's an absurdity. And that, I think, is why many remain within the local authority, because there's a degree of comfort attached to the fact that, well, the local authority, they won't do us wrong. But fundamentally, by missing out competitive tender, your contracts are probably costing 15 to 20% more than they should at the best of times. So that, to me, is the primary message to get across. Now, I think probably the best thing to do, if you're in agreement, rather than tackle each of the issues here, is to look back at some of the questions you may be asking, and some which are there, to see whether we can cover that at the same time. But above all, I'd like you to go away with the thought process that you are able, and your partner in energy, hopefully Powerful Allies, but others, is able to look at the market much further ahead and help you in those decisions. And there's some critical decisions to make right now, and we'll come to those as the session progresses, I think. So if you don't mind, I'll hand you back to Becky.
Thank you, James. Yes, thank you to all of you that asked questions upon registration, of which we have several, but I'd also like to give everybody in this session the opportunity to ask questions as well. So pop them into the chat, any questions that you have, and I will do my best to cover the questions that we've also had from people that are signed up. So you may well already hear your question read out. So first question is, our multi-academy trust is currently part of a local authority framework arrangement, and our CFO is being asked to provide evidence to the board as to how this provides best value. What can I expect to see from the LA, and does a framework actually deliver that best value?
Well, as I mentioned, it can't demonstrate best value. It was never intended to deliver best value. Local authority procurement came from the need for local authorities for energy, and at the time their procurement was managed, and to a great extent was managed through organisations controlled by the Cabinet Office. Now, without being facetious, I don't know of any local authority that's particularly good at buying anything, but bluntly, it is simply not the nature of the beast. What we find is that the strategy for a local authority is, broadly speaking, to remain within 2% of the wholesale market. And we know how the Cabinet Office judges. So if the procurement strategy effectively tracks the wholesale market, then the achievement has been met. Now, we can see today the wholesale market has moved aggressively away from where it was historically. And it may well be that staying plus or minus 2% of a reasonably stable wholesale market is not a bad achievement. But if you're in a very volatile position, then you've lost control, and that's where we are at. So to a great extent, the local authority framework can say we've done our job, we've achieved our job. But that isn't delivering best value, because there is no competitive tender within that process. There's no contract, no option to secure different contract duration, and there is no transparency in the process of how that supplier is chosen. Okay, so why are we working with the suppliers that we are with local authorities? What are their reasons? And I have to say, as Tim has written extensively, there's complete opacity in the background to choosing what becomes your main supplier. And I have to say, in this day and age, given the responsibilities of governors and trustees, that lack of opacity is simply not acceptable. It's not fit for purpose, in my view. Back to you.
Thank you, James. So, question from Sue. Our LA provider has just bought into contracts for 19 ppkWh. We're in a somewhat surprising position of apparently rolling into the renewal, even though it states on our contract it's a 3-year contract which ends 31st of October 2022. I'm trying to work out how we can still be tied in until 2025 as they state. I'm waiting some clarification. Any ideas?
Absolutely. When we first became involved with academies, it was a few years ago, and over a period of a few weeks, we were asked and appointed by nearly 65 academies, all of whom were with Laser at the time. I'm sure some of your viewers will recognise that. At that stage, Laser required an opt-in to their framework, which had to be declared in February. They sent a letter out to all schools asking them to confirm if they were going to join into the next round. They were quite astonished by the reaction, which was a no reaction at all. None of them wanted to rejoin in September. So they then sent out a negative option, i.e., you are involved with this unless you tell us otherwise. And I don't know what letters have been sent to schools recently, but the approach we've seen generally has been, unless you opt out, you're in. Okay. Now that decision was being made 6 months earlier. It may vary with West Mercia and others. We don't really get involved with that. But it is the case that schools can be tied into long rolling contracts simply because they failed to react to a letter. Now, we did point out at the time, I won't go on, but this is a very sore point, because we had to work really hard to get schools out of laser at the time, particularly since the notifications were sent deliberately during half term when the schools were all closed. And in fact, the final reminders were sent out, I think it was probably the end of July, when the schools were all closed. Okay, so we have to recognise here, laser and local authority procurement, these are not charities, these are not not-for-profit organisations, they're highly profitable organisations generating revenue for local authorities and for themselves. They are brokers, effectively, working with the government. So in short, I would insist, and I think given that you are still, say, what are we, 6 to 8 months away, I think there's a chance you should be allowed to get out of it, but you're going to have to fight for that right. And that is the reality of it.
Great, thanks, James, who also said thank you. I have got another question, but I'm going to jump to another one because they've also mentioned that they're with laser. So this is a large maintained primary tied into a contract via the LA until 2024, whereby we've purchased forward so our prices will not change until September. We need to advise in August whether we want to stay within the arrangement after 2024. How do we ascertain whether it would be better leaving the arrangement and going out on our own, bearing in mind they're with laser?
Well, this is the great catch-22, of course, which we've had to live with. We now work with 300 academies, and many of them have had to go through this particular hurdle. The catch-22 is laser will not give you a price from September 24 onwards. So if you're trying to compare best value against, for example, powerful allies, whereas we can give you a price for that, laser can't. The only way we demonstrate that is to look historically, and that's really how we tend to work, is to look back at what you have been paying against what you should have been paying. And that is really how we work. And a number of those in the session today will be familiar with that because we're in discussion with them on that point. But the best way for us to prove it is to say, well, okay, this is what you have been paying under this banner. This is what your equivalent academy has been paying under a free market, open competitive tender. And your governments have to judge whether that demonstrates the point. But you will never get a price from any of the local authority frameworks which goes past the end of their contract because they don't know what it is. They literally do not know what it will be. And that, of course, is the absurdity because we could get a price today from the supply from September onwards, September 24 onwards, but it creates a dilemma. And of course, the result of that is to a great extent, I won't say inertia sets in, but it's very difficult to persuade governors and trustees to leave something which they feel is safe. Let me put it that way. Back to you again.
Thank you. So good question here. Given that Vladimir has gone into Ukraine, how do you see this affecting the prices for academies procuring for September?
Well, the graphs you've seen, and I've sent some updated graphs today, which show a number of effects. First of all, long before the recent threat upon Ukraine, the market had tried to recover from the huge damage that was done to suppliers during COVID. So the reason when we placed contracts in April 20, it wasn't because we weren't reading our palm or anything of that sort. It was pretty obvious that once the country eventually came out of lockdown, energy suppliers would have to push prices up very rapidly to recover the considerable damage which was done to them over lockdown. Now, just to make the point, schools to a great extent, I know you had mixed openings and closings, but if you look at the whole of hospitality, manufacturing, a whole range of other sectors were completely closed. And so you have suppliers who have bought huge volumes forward and literally no market for it. Nobody sell it. You can't sell electricity to anybody historically. You can't save it effectively. And they lost fortunes. E.ON laid off 2,000 staff. Empower folded and went into E.ON, and we know what's happened subsequently. So it was obvious that suppliers would need to rebuild their profits going forward, and that's what's been happening prior to Christmas. Compound that with the fact that the largest gas producer in the world, Gazprom, is half state-owned by the Russians, and it doesn't take a lot of imagination to see that we're in a very difficult position right now. I believe that the latest store of gas we have is only 4.7% of what it would normally be. So Gazprom have, together with Russia, strategically diminished our storage capacity. So we have very little reserves in place. So we're in a hard place as far as gas supply is concerned, and that is reflected. Why does gas have an impact on electricity? It's because we use a large amount of gas now instead of coal to produce electricity. Okay, so gas is a very important energy for us, not easy to replace quickly. So we are in a position where prices are at unprecedented high. Now, again, we have to learn from this. We are where we are, and schools will no doubt face, if their contracts are coming up at the end of March, or if they're out of contract, then they're going to face very significant increases. And I'd like to touch on how we manage that, what strategies are in place. But I would say in all these things, there is a cycle. And we're right in the middle still of winter pricing, effectively. This is still the winter season. And with our own clients, any that we've got coming up for contract later this year, September, October, November, we're not even looking at prices today for them. That would just be frightening. What's the point? We know it's going to look horrific. But we are anticipating that as we come out of winter into April, May, and June, that markets will stabilize as much as they will do at that point. Now, there's no way they're going back to those pre-September day values, but I think in our view, there's no point in rushing either. And if anybody is in contracts till September with a broker rather than with local authority, then my counsel would be to wait until May probably and early June before you contract, and you have to then go with the market at that point. Okay. If the market continues to rise despite summer pricing, then obviously it doesn't bode well. But I don't believe that's going to be the case. Our feeling is that the market will recuperate to a great extent once we know what's happening with Ukraine, which I don't think will last for long.
Sarah's very similar question. She says she's unable. Is there feedback coming? Is it just coming from my head? Sorry. So yes, local authority maintains school but doesn't buy through the local authority. Contract ends March 23. Should Sarah sit and wait regarding Ukraine, COVID, etc.? When is the best time for her to take action?
Lovely. Well, good for you. You're going to do nothing now, please. If anybody rings you, tell them to go to hell, put bluntly, because nobody should be contacting you now about a contract starting in March 23. My strong suggestion is that you tender that with us or whoever in June this year to see what the market looks like for next year. In reality, you'll want to contract that before you come out of the summer season. So by the end of September this year, you should be in that March contract, March 23 ending contract. Don't go into the winter period without that contract in place, okay? Now, what I would also say, while on the subject, is March ending contracts don't make much sense to schools. They are a historic hangover from local authority. Unless I'm mistaken, the majority of your year ends will be August, which will be normal. And actually, September contract end date is a better time to end a contract. So you don't have to go for a 12-month of anything. And one of the strategies that we're looking at for clients right now who come to us in the position is to extend their contracts out to September rather than just to repeat a 12-month cycle. And you may say, well, what's the benefit of that? Well, it's a fairly technical one, but when an energy price is fixed for a year, it's effectively what we call a blended rate. It takes account of winter rates, which are always much higher, and summer rates, which tend to be lower. Okay, so if we extend a contract out to September, we've gained ourselves an extra summer, effectively, for that period. It aligns with the financial year, and it also means that actually you've got your blended rate includes 2 summers and 1 winter, and that has quite an impact upon the pricing. So right now, if people are saying, do I do a 12 or 24 month? In this position, I say you do neither. You do an 18 month. Okay, thank you.
Brilliant. We've got another great question coming up, but this one's on a similar thread. So Julianne says, contracts finishing October 22 and Jan 23 for the trust. Previously, the trust moved from the local authority and used a broker to procure both gas and electricity. Haven't been very happy with the services, but they were thinking of procuring both through the DFE buying for schools, starting the process from April 2022. Any advice on that one?
Don't.
Oh.
Seriously, we'll come to that later.
Okay.
There is a serious problem here that the buying for schools concept, which we'll discuss, I'm sure Tim will, is not at all fit for purpose. And I have to be careful what I say, but we're very, very aware of this. It was set up predominantly through Crown Commercial Services. These are not fully competitive sites. They are still run by effectively unregulated energy brokers. And whilst there is some comfort in the fact that DFE endorse this, there's a serious issue about how and why they're endorsing what is such a poor product. And in fact, Tim's got some statistics I gave him before the meeting about that. Let me just talk through the process to go here. First of all, if we were working with you, and I have to come back to that, we're not here to advertise ourselves, but let's talk it through. The first thing we're going to do is to consolidate your contract end dates. You don't want different contract end dates. It makes life very complicated, unnecessarily so. You don't want contracts ending in January either, because if you're going to change supplier, and you may well want to change supplier, you don't want to be doing that in the middle of winter when you're using most consumption, because any hiccup in that process, particularly if the school is closed, it can go on to out of contract rates very quickly, and it's very difficult to recover that. So the first strategy really would be to look to align to, as I mentioned, end of September for both contracts. Now that may change the supplier choice that you have. You're going to tender everything together, even though they have different contract end dates. You're going to tender the whole lot as if it's one, and you'll have contracts which may be asymmetric. So they won't all be 12 months or 18 months, they may be 21 months, whatever. But your objective is to align contract end date and to simplify the supplier strategy you've got in place. The one thing we haven't touched on at all is how much that broker earns. And we're going to come to that, I think, later on, because this is a very, very important issue. Back to my point about why would brokers be calling anybody right now, it's because the money that brokers can make is phenomenal as an unregulated broker. And this is, I have to say, I'm proud to say, the reason that we are here today is because we are an approved recommended partner, not just of Visible, but the Independent School Bursars Association, Catholic Independent Schools Trust, Methodist Independent Schools Trust, and so it goes on, because we effectively have a code of practice that we apply to all of our procurement. That's very crucial. Does that help?
Question for Shane. She's asking, is renewable energy in line with the market price? So they also need to be net zero by 2030.
Very important point. So some 7 years ago, we turned all of our contracts to renewable energy. So every single contract we've placed in the last 7 years has been 100% renewable energy for electricity at no extra cost to our clients at all. So the reality of it is most suppliers and certainly all brokers will try and charge more for it. They should not. It should not cost you more. And I wouldn't dream of tendering anything other than renewable energy for your electricity. Now, gas is a quite different issue. There isn't such a thing as renewable gas. There is biomethane, which is a kind of a blended rate, and it is much more expensive and can be very much more expensive. So we have to accept that gas will remain a primary fuel supply. And I wouldn't recommend academies with limited budgets move into what's called green gas at this stage. There are organisations we work with who, as a matter of principle, use green gas, but I think given the pressures on budgets right now, I wouldn't recommend it. And in fact, in many ways, it is the emissions are virtually identical between natural gas and biomethane gas. So I'll come back later, I think, onto the school switch site or the school transfer site online. But no, first of all, you have no other service from that. The point should be made that this is a pure broking site. It does nothing more for you. It doesn't monitor anything. It doesn't help you on your net zero strategy. It doesn't work with you in energy reduction strategies. All these things that go together as an energy partner, which is what we're about. And we haven't talked about the balance of roles, but procurement is just the start of the journey for my team, half of our work, if not more, is working with schools in energy reduction strategies, which is really where we earn our keep, put bluntly. So I think schools need to be looking for a more comprehensive relationship with an energy partner going forward, rather than just somebody to buy a contract, if that's helpful.
Thank you. Sarah asks, she took up the government's loan to have decarbonisation survey. For the cost of replacing boilers, you can have ground source heating or solar panels fitted. What are your thoughts on this?
I think probably, well, two things in the past. It is site specific. Again, without knowing the site, it's difficult to judge whether solar PV is the way to go. Let's look at the things which you should obviously do, which are LED installations. Of course, you should do that. I would avoid any complicated arrangements with that. They're not complicated technologies. I encourage you not to get involved in energy as a service concepts where you're effectively leasing lighting. It's a very, very complicated model. I think is completely unsuited for schools. So just get on and replace them. The quicker you replace them, the better. Now, I know schools will tend to sometimes phase LED replacements, but that doesn't make sense because the saving is the energy consumption part of it. So the quicker you change those old bulbs for LEDs, the better. Gas boilers can be a very quick win because modern technology gas boilers can reduce consumption dramatically. But one of the areas you need to look at particularly, and this isn't my specialty, but Sean Midgley, who's my MD, he was a Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineer. Sean spends his life doing this. But one thing you should really look carefully at is if you have any building management systems working, because very often the technology involved is beyond those who operate them to fully control. So if you have BMS, make sure that's set up correctly and you haven't got your boilers running day and night, for example. But I think if we're looking at specifics, we would need to look at that at a site-specific level. I'm sorry to be a little bit inconclusive on that, but that's the reality of it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Sarah did say that they fitted LEDs last year, so that was very reassuring.
Very good.
Alistair asked, what are your views on blended or flexi contracts?
The term, let's get clear on this. I detest flexi contracts because you cannot tender them. Basically, a flexible contract is like blancmange. You simply cannot compare suppliers with a product which is flexible by definition. Now, some would argue, well, they're better than making a commitment, but actually suppliers do that already. And when you go out to tender, even in the market today, suppliers will provide different pricing to take account of different contract start dates and duration, and suppliers are much better placed to judge pricing than schools are. A flexi contract leaves the risk with the academy. So if the market goes up, the academy gets hit by it, and maybe if the market goes down, the academy benefits. But are you really in the business of taking risk on energy procurement? And I think this, for me, is a very important point. I do not believe it is the role of an academy to speculate on energy markets, and flexible contracts do exactly that effectively. Okay.
Thank you. We've got another question around timings, but I'll come back to that in a moment just because we've been talking about LED. Jonathan asked, why do you say to avoid leasing LED equipment? We're currently looking at this to spread the cost over time, which could be met through the savings in energy costs.
The models that are out there for that, and let me just clarify that. The models which are being marketed by, let's say, brokers and suppliers have very little transparency in the process. You very rarely know what it's actually going to cost you to do. You don't necessarily know what the APR is on the borrowing. And at the end of the day, there's a great tendency for them, an inclination for them to overstate the savings which are applicable, because that's what they do. Their job is to sell and install LEDs. If we're looking at funding models, there are other solutions to funding. And our recommendation, what we do all the time, is to undertake a full competitive tender for the LED installation, and then to look at the optimum funding solutions. And I think Tim is probably best to come on here because we work with a very good mutual partner who's involved specifically in providing funding for LED installations for schools. And I think that's the way to go. So if we're talking about a scheme where you have an independent finance provider and you can judge that as a separate funding model, that's fine. But if it's rolled into an energy as a service leasing product, it's a much more complicated thing, and I would discourage it. Okay, Becky.
Okay, so Nikki's asking, so this is a timing question. Our contract runs to November 2023. We're being advised by Honest Utility Group to secure a 2-year contract with our current supplier. Should I wait until later in the year?
Can you please terminate their letter of authority? The first thing, seriously, it is just absurd. Why on earth would one want a contract in a market which is at its highest ever level? The only reason is because whoever they are is paid commission upfront for the contract that you're going to sign up. And let's be blunt about that. That's exactly what happens. Otherwise, why are they even on the phone? You can look at the graph yourself, and common sense says, why would you contract when the market is this high? The reason this has a bearing is that if the market is high today, it feeds into future pricing. Of course it does. There are no special deals to be started in 24 which ignore the current market. You have to wait until the market is at a more controlled level. You've got plenty of time for that, which is good. And if you're looking at November contract start date, you probably don't need to look until April next year, April, May next year. And I wouldn't look at the market before then. But you have to question, why would any energy partner trying to give you best value and provide best advice would advise anybody to go into a contract right now? It's just absurd. And then sadly, this is the world that we're in. There are 2,500 unregulated brokers out there, and most of them are call centres. A large number of them are based in the northeast. I have to say that as a Robson, I'm afraid, coming from Sunderland myself, I'm rather saddened by that. But the reality of it is they are fed by commission. That's all that drives them. That's all they want, and it's not what you need.
So a question that we had from a registrant, a school business manager. They were recently asked to audit the itemised costs on the last 12 months of gas and electricity bills. When they did that, they found that don't seem to have a direct contract with the energy provider, only an agreement with the broker. Is this a good idea, and how can they get the details of the contract from the broker themselves?
You mentioned the broker there. I hope to be careful. I mean, I know people have different views about this. Energy are a very well-established supplier, a broker within the marketplace. I don't particularly favour their way of working in terms of their contract structure, but it is what it is. And I know them well enough to know that they're not people who are going to deliberately abuse that position. That's not how they work. My suggestion is, if you're struggling to get data, send an email to me or to Tim, and I'll ask Graham Cook, who's the chairman of Energy, to provide the data for you.
Another question from the room. How do you cancel letters of authority? I'm sure a couple of brokers have these from them.
You just, you must limit the number of letters of authority in the marketplace. And I'll come back to, I'd like to touch on that now. There is not a standard format for letters of authority. And some of them are very, very shocking in many ways. They can include within them phraseology which allows the broker to enter contracts on your behalf without any authority from you. And we see it. And we're dealing with mis-selling on a huge scale where these have been applied. So what is the purpose of a letter of authority? If you're using it for a tender process, you can limit its duration. You can say it's valid only for 3 months or something of that sort. But I would discourage you from having multiple letters of authority out with anybody you don't know, because they can use them. And most of all, they can really confuse suppliers, because suppliers don't want to deal with multiple brokers. They want to deal with one who has authority to act on the school's behalf and negotiate. And they don't have the time to deal with half a dozen brokers, ringing them up all asking for the same price. It's just not, it is not in their interest. And they will certainly never give a better rate if there are multiple brokers involved, because they have to give the same rate to each broker. So in withdrawing them, it is an email to the broker saying, further to my letter of authority, I'm terminating it with immediate effect. And if you need to contact your suppliers, email the supplier to say, I've terminated this letter of authority with immediate effect, and ask the broker to confirm in writing that they've acknowledged that and have terminated it. Okay.
Thank you.
Yep.
Another question from Jane. We have 4 gas contracts and 3 electricity contracts. They all have different contract end dates. The earliest is March 2022 and the latest is March 2023. What's the best thing for them to be able to reconcile those contracts?
Well, your March ones are coming up now, so you tender them all together. You look at them all as if they're one. Now, why would I say that? If you go and look at each meter in isolation, possibly with different suppliers, I don't know whether that's the case, if you do a best value tender, the chances are you'll have a different supplier for each of them because you're tendering them each at different times. And mathematically, it's because suppliers change their relative competitiveness all the time, you could end up with 4 different suppliers for each of them. And that makes life extraordinarily complicated. You're also missing the benefit of compounding your volume to be a larger contract. And the larger your contract, the lower the rates are. So if you add them all together, you then become part of a bigger buying strategy. And you're part of, as in our case, what's called bespoke contracting. So a contract is specifically created for the school. If you tender them each in isolation, you fall into what would be called matrix or SME pricing, where you pay effectively a rate card, as if you were a very small business. And that doesn't make sense at all. So get them all together, tender them as one, and consolidate with a single supplier. And as I've mentioned, I think the first thing to do is to move them all to September end date.
Thank you. Interesting one from Rachel. If I run our own electricity tender for the MAT, who should they approach to tender? Currently with Haven directly, but their service is poor.
I don't know of any large client in any sector that tenders directly with a supplier. I don't mean to be rude, but this is a very, very complicated sector, particularly with electricity. You have very complicated contract structures. And you would not know today, from your experience, which are the most competitive suppliers out there. Now, you know, we're placing contracts literally, even now, we're placing contracts every day. So we know the market today with all suppliers. We know their pitfalls. We know where they try and pull the wool over people's eyes. Haven is no longer Haven. They're now effectively called Drax. And there are issues about their product in terms of renewable energy. The Drax power station is still a high polluter by European standards. So there are lots of issues involved, but I would not encourage anybody to tender and try and tender directly with a supplier. You're still working with the sales team at the other end. And do they have your interest at stake? Well, of course they have. They have their own commission at stake. So I would, if you're not happy with Haven, you need to look across the market. I'm not going to advertise our own company, but that is what we do every day. That's what we would do for you. And if you wanted to get stuck in with that, we're happy to do so following this meeting. Of course we will.
Okay. Looking at time, we're almost out. So just one more question from Jonathan, which is more of a procurement question, is how to go about procuring LED lighting through a tender. Imagine it would be difficult to produce a specification as we won't know how best to light the room, number of lights, wattage, etc.
Okay, it's a very, very good question. That the specification design is crucial to this. And to a great extent, it's difficult to get the design worked up unless you are to some degree committing to the partner. And we place a huge amount of LED installations ourselves. All I can say is if you want a good recommended partner, we can provide that for you. And then they'll specify and install. But you're quite right, it's difficult to tender when you've got a specification which needs to be produced. The alternative is to provide just pay for a specification to be produced in isolation, and then you do your shopping. But it's not an easy thing. I accept that.
Just one more question, actually, probably just to solidify for everybody here today. Is the best deal for a MAT to go through a broker? You would get a better deal than the local authority. Is that correct?
I have to caveat this because there are 2,500 brokers out there, and I spend a large amount of my time trying to highlight the need for clients to understand exactly what the broker is earning. Because the reason we have a problem here is there is no standard commission level payable to brokers. It's called uplift, and each broker, including ourselves, determines how much they can add onto the unit rate. And in our case, it works out at roughly 1%. In the case of other companies I can mention, it can be 10 times that. It can even be 30 times that. So I can't say, leave it to a broker. I can only judge from our own position as to who we work with. And my point is we're here because we have a reputation, if you like, in a sector which is crucial to us. And we're not going to shoot ourselves in the foot on that. But I mentioned earlier, if you're getting cold calls from brokers of any description, then why are they doing it? It is simply not in your interests, and you need to work with trusted partners in whatever sector you apply. And that's the same for our clients in hospitality and elsewhere. So I know that we can outgun a local authority and prove best value. I certainly don't know that's the case when it comes to others out there in the marketplace.
Thank
There
you.
was one question I spotted about Ecologic, I think it was, about commission levels. Can we just have that one? I'd like to tackle that, please.
Yes, so recently authorised Ecologic partners to look into commission charged by Laser and Zenergy. Is this a good move or a futile exercise?
I think in fairness to Zenergy, as I say, if somebody asked us and they do what we earn, we always discuss it with us, we always declare it. We have to make a living and we're very comfortable with that. And all of our clients know exactly what we earn. And I think Zenergy, given their position in the marketplace, are perfectly capable of accepting that and confirming that as well. However, the local authority is something else. And if any of you ever find out what the local authority earn, please let me know, because none of us know.
And James, just to confirm, Powerful Allies are also a broker.
Yes, we earn our living. We started primarily with very, very large energy contracts, but the approach we adopted was something which I set up at the outset called Open Competition Charter, and it was a definition of how we would work in terms of transparency. To my surprise, we find ourselves working with many hundreds of schools. It wasn't the market we expected to be involved with, but we are a broker. We're paid commission by suppliers, and all of our clients know what that is. And for those of the attendees who met us, I think they can vouch for that. The other thing we do, which I think is unique, is if you go onto our website, powerfuleyes.com, you can see who else we work with in your own sector. There's a very, very large schedule with the many hundreds of companies that are there and their comments. So ring them up and find out what we do. And we'd love to work with you.
Thank you. Right, we're almost out of time, so just wanted to pop in a quick poll. Just gives everybody the opportunity, if they'd like to either speak to James or Tim or myself about anything that we've discussed today. You can get in touch that way. We will be sending out some information afterwards. We'll send a recording of this session. You've already had the packs with the graphs and those sorts of things, but if anybody has any questions around those, you can ask us through that way. Just to also say, we've got some new sessions for coffee clubs coming up. I'm just going to put a link into the chat. So covering lots of things around finance governance, setting your budget, the upcoming census, but also a session with Tim on SIF bids coming in May. So that's a good one to look forward to. So any final questions from the floor? No, that's great. Just wanted to say thank you, Tim. Thank you, James, for a very enlightening session. I know everybody's had lots of burning questions answered. So thank you very much. And yeah, get in touch if you want to know some more. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for putting up with me for an hour. Do appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Becky, for hosting us. Yes, we'll look forward to fielding any future questions.
Genuinely my pleasure.
Thank you.
Lots of thanks coming in through the chat.
Yes, great.
It was great as well to see in the chat lots of people kind of responding and saying, that's really answered my question. Thank you very much.
Oh, definitely. The number of thank yous and yeah, that people are clearly very grateful for the quality of the advice, James.
Yes, thanks, James.
Well, I really enjoyed it. Good questions, really. I hope we covered all the areas. I think we didn't really get to fully cover school switch. I think, Tim, that was the only thing I would say.
We didn't. No, I know. I was thinking about sort of lobbying Becky, but there were so many good, pertinent, questions that it made sense to just continue with the flow. I mean, Becky, obviously this was predominantly about procurement, but we were obviously had to be an energy management, energy funding option. We could have gone on to that, but it may be that we look at another slot later on.
Absolutely, we can do a separate session that focuses just on energy management.
Yeah.
Thank you, Becky. I'll leave you now, okay? And thank you for the participants. It's wonderful that people give the time. Appreciate it.
Thanks, James. For anybody else, I'll be staying on just till the end if anybody wanted to ask a question in person.